It didn't move for 112 days, not once. The voice of Ranger Daniel Hayes echoed softly through the early morning fog as he stood at the edge of an abandoned campsite deep within the northern Montana forest. The air was cold, still carrying the scent of pine and wet earth after last night's rain. Everything around the clearing looked ordinary at first glance. A collapsed tent frame, a fire ring filled with cold ash, and a few weather-worn supplies half buried under fallen leaves. Yet there was one thing that did not belong to the silence of abandonment. A German shepherd sat perfectly still beside the fire ring, its body facing the same direction every single day, as if waiting for a signal only it could understand. Its fur was black and tan, slightly faded from exposure to wind and rain, but its posture remained strong, disciplined, almost military in its precision. Ranger Hayes adjusted his jacket and stepped closer, careful not to disturb the animal's focus. "Still here," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The dog did not react. It simply blinked once, slowly, and returned its gaze to the empty space in front of it. No barking, no pacing, no signs of fear or hunger beyond what instinct might allow. Just waiting. For months, hikers passing through the lower trail had reported sightings of the same dog in the same place. Some said it appeared at dawn and never left until nightfall. Others claimed they had seen it sitting through storms without moving an inch. At first, the reports were dismissed as misidentifications or wandering wildlife behavior, but the consistency of the descriptions eventually forced the ranger station to investigate. That is when Daniel Hayes was assigned to the case. He had expected a simple explanation, a lost hunting dog, perhaps, or an animal drawn to leftover food scraps from careless campers. But nothing about what he saw in the first minutes matched expectation. There was no scavenging behavior, no signs of distress, only ritual-like repetition, as if the dog had chosen this exact place for a reason it refused to forget. Hayes walked slowly around the perimeter of the campsite. The ground told a quieter story than the surface revealed. There were faint impressions in the soil, old footprints hardened by time, and traces of movement patterns that suggested someone had lived here for an extended period, not just passed through. Yet there was no sign of recent human presence. "Where is your owner?" Hayes asked under his breath, though he knew he would receive no answer. The German shepherd finally turned its head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, but its eyes did not break from focus. In that moment, the ranger felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. This was not a dog that had been abandoned and forgotten. This was a dog that had refused to leave, as if leaving would mean breaking a promise it could not afford to break. Hayes took out his field notebook and began documenting the scene, noting the position of the animal, the condition of the campsite, and the strange consistency of its behavior over time. As he wrote, the fog thickened between the trees, swallowing sound and distance until the entire clearing felt suspended outside of normal time. The German shepherd remained unmoving, guarding something that was no longer visible, but clearly not gone. And for the first time since arriving, Ranger Daniel Hayes realized this investigation was not about finding out why the dog was here. It was about discovering what it refused to forget. The morning fog had not fully lifted when Ranger Daniel Hayes made his second approach toward the abandoned campsite. The German shepherd was still there, unchanged, as if the passage of time had no authority over its decision to remain. Hayes noted immediately that nothing in the environment had shifted since his first observation. The fire ring was still cold and untouched, the collapsed tent frame still leaned at the same angle against the wind, and the scattered supplies remained half-buried beneath damp forest debris. Yet the dog had not moved an inch. It sat with the same precise posture, facing the same direction, its attention locked onto a point that offered no visible explanation. Hayes adjusted the strap of his field pack and slowly circled the site again, this time moving farther into the surrounding tree line. The forest here was dense, quiet, and layered with years of untouched growth. Moss covered fallen logs, and the ground softened under thick pine needles that absorbed every sound of movement. As he scanned the perimeter, he began noticing subtle inconsistencies. The campsite was not random. It had been selected with intention. The positioning of the fire ring, the alignment of flattened ground where a tent had once stood, even the faint remnants of rope tied between two trees suggested long-term habitation rather than temporary camping. Hayes paused near a broken wooden stake partially buried in soil. Faint markings carved into its surface had been nearly erased by weather, but not completely. He knelt down and brushed away layers of dirt carefully, revealing what looked like an old identification marker. It was military in structure, though too worn to confirm origin immediately. This was not just a campsite, he murmured quietly, his voice barely rising above the forest wind. Behind him, the German shepherd shifted for the first time since his arrival. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but deliberate. The dog's ears angled slightly forward, responding not to Hayes, but to something deeper within the environment. Hayes turned back toward it, studying the animal more closely. There was no aggression, no anxiety, no confusion, only certainty. The kind of certainty that did not require explanation. As Hayes continued his inspection, he began documenting the layout more precisely. The spacing between objects suggested routine organization. The wear patterns in the soil indicated repeated use of the same pathways. Even the positioning of stones near the fire ring appeared deliberately arranged rather than naturally scattered. It was as if someone had lived here not just temporarily, but with structure and discipline. Yet every trace of human presence ended abruptly beyond a certain point, as if the site had simply been paused. The German shepherd suddenly stood, not in alarm, but in response. Its body remained controlled, its gaze still fixed forward, but now there was a subtle tension in its stance, like a memory being triggered, rather than a threat being detected. Hayes followed the direction of its focus deeper into the clearing. There was nothing visible at first, only trees, fog, and silence. But as he looked longer, he noticed something subtle near the far edge of the campsite boundary. A narrow trail, almost invisible unless viewed from a specific angle, leading deeper into the forest. It was not marked. It was not natural. It had been walked repeatedly. Hayes felt a shift in understanding forming slowly, uncomfortable in its implication. The dog was not guarding the campsite itself. It was guarding what lay beyond it. And whatever that was, it had never been forgotten. The narrow trail beyond the campsite disappeared quickly into denser forest, swallowed by layers of fog and overlapping pine branches that blocked most of the fading morning light. Ranger Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of the marked boundary, watching the German shepherd step forward without hesitation. The dog did not rush, nor did it look back. It simply entered the path as if it had walked it countless times before. Hayes hesitated for a moment, his instincts warning him that deeper forest meant less visibility, weaker signal, and fewer reference points. Yet something about the animal's certainty made hesitation feel unnecessary. He adjusted his field gear and followed. The moment he stepped onto the narrow trail, the environment shifted. The ground became firmer, shaped by repeated passage, and faint depressions in the soil revealed what could only be described as consistent movement patterns. This was not an animal trail. It was structured, intentional, and maintained over time. The German shepherd continued ahead, occasionally pausing at subtle markers hidden among roots and stones. At one point, it stopped beside a broken branch placed deliberately across two rocks. Hayes noticed immediately that it was not random. The placement suggested guidance, a directional indicator for someone familiar with survival navigation. He crouched briefly, studying the arrangement. "Who taught you this?" he muttered under his breath, though no answer came. The dog had already moved forward again, maintaining its steady pace. As they progressed deeper, the forest grew quieter. Bird calls faded, wind movement lessened, and even the crunch of footsteps seemed absorbed by the terrain. The silence was not empty. It was concentrated, as if the forest itself was holding something back from being disturbed. Hayes began to notice additional signs along the path. Small carved markings on tree trunks, some nearly erased by time, others still faintly visible beneath layers of moss. They were too consistent to be natural. At one point, he found a small metal tag partially embedded in bark, rusted but still attached. It bore no obvious identification, but its shape resembled standard field equipment used in military or ranger operations. The realization formed slowly, uncomfortable but increasingly clear. Someone had lived here with structure, discipline, and intention. Not a casual camper, not a wanderer. Someone trained to survive in isolation for extended periods. The German shepherd suddenly stopped again, this time remaining completely still. Its body posture changed slightly, more alert, more focused. Hayes followed its gaze forward and saw that the trail opened into a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. At the center stood remnants of something that had once been carefully constructed. Wooden supports, partially collapsed, formed the outline of what might have been a long-term shelter. Not abandoned carelessly, but left gradually over time. There were no recent signs of human presence, yet everything about the site suggested life had once been maintained here with precision. Hayes stepped slowly into the clearing, his boots pressing into soft ground layered with years of fallen pine needles. The German shepherd remained at the edge, watching the structure without moving closer. That hesitation, more than anything else, confirmed what Hayes had begun to suspect. This place was not empty. It was paused, and whatever story had begun here was still waiting to be understood. The moment Ranger Daniel Hayes stepped fully into the clearing, the air changed. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but the deeper he walked between the broken wooden structures, the heavier the silence became. It was not the silence of an empty place. It was the silence of something once alive with routine, now left untouched for reasons that had not yet been spoken. The German shepherd remained at the edge of the clearing, refusing to enter further. Its posture stayed firm, alert, and controlled, but there was a hesitation in its stillness that Hayes had not seen before. The dog was not afraid. It was waiting for recognition. Hayes moved slowly through the remains of what had once been a structured campsite. The wooden supports, though partially collapsed, showed clear signs of intentional construction. Nails were driven in straight, joints reinforced, and certain sections strengthened against wind exposure. This was not temporary survival work. This had been built with expectation of long-term use. He crouched beside a flat surface that might once have served as a table or planning station. Beneath layers of dirt and pine debris, he noticed faint impressions of organized placement, as if items had once been arranged in a deliberate order. "Someone lived here," he said quietly, breaking the silence for the first time since entering. His voice did not carry far. The forest seemed to absorb it. As Hayes continued scanning the area, he found additional details that deepened the complexity of the site. A partially buried metal container, sealed but rusted, sat beneath a collapsed beam. Nearby, fragments of fabric clung to nails driven into wood, suggesting that personal belongings had once been secured here rather than abandoned. The German shepherd finally stepped forward by a few feet, stopping again near what appeared to be the center of the campsite. It lowered its head slightly, then remained completely still, as if acknowledging a memory rather than reacting to present conditions. Hayes followed the dog's line of sight and noticed something he had overlooked before. Beneath a layer of moss-covered wood, there was a carved marking on a support beam. It was faint, but still visible enough to suggest deliberate inscription. Not random scratches, not animal damage, intentional carving. He brushed away debris carefully with his gloved hand, revealing a set of initials and a date, partially worn but still readable enough to suggest military-style identification rather than casual marking. Hayes felt a shift in understanding that he could not ignore. This was no longer a simple case of an animal refusing to leave an abandoned campsite. This was a place tied to identity, memory, and something far more personal than survival. The German shepherd suddenly moved again, this time walking toward the far side of the clearing where the forest grew denser and darker. Hayes followed immediately, stepping over collapsed wood and uneven ground. As he approached the edge of the clearing, he noticed a narrow continuation of the trail, barely visible beneath overgrowth, leading deeper into the forest. The dog stopped at its entrance and turned its head slightly back toward him. Not to warn, not to flee, but to indicate continuation. Hayes looked from the hidden path back to the broken campsite, then to the dog once more. The realization settled slowly, unavoidable and precise. Whatever had happened here did not end in this clearing. It had only paused here, and the truth was still waiting somewhere further inside the forest. The narrow trail beyond the second clearing felt different the moment Ranger Daniel Hayes stepped onto it. It was no longer a path shaped by routine movement or casual passage. The ground was firmer, compressed in patterns that suggested repetition over long periods of time, as if someone had walked this exact line so many times that the forest had begun to accept it as permanent. The German shepherd stood a few feet ahead, waiting without turning back, its body angled toward the deeper forest where the canopy thickened and the light weakened. Hayes adjusted his pace to match the dog's measured movement. Every instinct he had as a ranger told him this was no longer a simple observation case. Something had been built here emotionally, not just physically. As they advanced, the forest changed subtly. The spacing between trees narrowed, and the undergrowth became more controlled, as if deliberately cleared in certain sections. Hayes noticed faint signs along the way, small indicators carved into bark at intervals too consistent to be accidental. They were not official trail markers, yet they followed a logic that suggested navigation support rather than decoration. He stopped once to examine a tree trunk where a shallow marking had been etched into the wood. It was old, softened by weather, but still intentional. A directional symbol, simple and repeated in different forms along the route. "This is maintained," Hayes said quietly, more to confirm his own thinking than to communicate with anyone else. The German shepherd paused ahead, waiting again as if acknowledging the need for him to catch up rather than urging him forward. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. Wind movement lessened, bird calls disappeared, and even the sound of their footsteps seemed absorbed into the terrain rather than carried across it. The silence was structured, almost disciplined, as though the environment itself had adapted to prolonged human presence in the past. After several minutes of steady movement, the path widened slightly into another natural opening. Unlike the previous campsite, this area showed fewer signs of collapse and more signs of intentional removal. Vegetation had been cleared in a controlled radius, suggesting maintenance rather than abandonment. Hayes slowed immediately, scanning the perimeter with increased focus. At the center of the clearing stood the remains of a reinforced structure, more stable than anything he had seen so far. Wooden beams still held partial alignment, and metal fasteners, though rusted, indicated careful construction techniques consistent with someone trained in field engineering or military survival operations. The German shepherd entered the clearing without hesitation this time, walking directly toward the center and stopping beside a flattened area where the ground appeared intentionally leveled. Hayes followed, stepping carefully between exposed roots and weathered boards. He noticed something new here that had not been present in previous locations. Personal organization. Not abandonment, but transition. Items had been removed in a way that suggested preparation rather than escape. A nearby tree held a series of deeper carvings, more structured than earlier markings. These were not random or survival-based. They resembled records. Dates, sequences, and short identifiers etched into the bark with precision. Hayes felt the weight of realization building gradually. This was not a campsite left behind in chaos. It was a structured living site that had been deliberately deactivated, but not forgotten. The German shepherd suddenly sat at the center of the clearing, facing inward, perfectly still once again. Hayes looked at the dog, then at the surrounding environment, and finally at the markings that surrounded them. The pattern was becoming clearer with every step. Whatever had once happened here was not isolated to one moment or one place. It had extended across time, across movement, and across memory. And the dog was not wandering through loss. It was returning to it with purpose. The deeper clearing they had entered began to reveal something Ranger Daniel Hayes had not expected to find in a place this remote. The air felt different here, less like untouched wilderness and more like a space that had once been carefully maintained and then slowly allowed to return to nature. The German shepherd remained seated at the center of the site, its posture unchanged, its attention fixed inward rather than outward, as if the clearing itself held a memory only it could perceive. Hayes stood at the edge for a moment, carefully observing every detail before stepping further inside. The ground beneath his boots was unusually level compared to the surrounding forest floor, suggesting deliberate preparation rather than natural formation. Fallen branches had been cleared away in a consistent radius, and the remaining vegetation grew in patterns that hinted at long-term human presence rather than abandonment. As Hayes moved slowly through the space, he noticed additional markings that confirmed his growing suspicion. On several trees surrounding the clearing were engraved symbols arranged in a sequence that repeated with slight variation. They were not random survival scratches. They followed a structured logic, almost like coded markers meant to guide someone familiar with their meaning. He paused at one tree where the bark bore deeper carvings than the rest. Running his gloved fingers lightly across the surface, he could feel the intentional pressure behind each line. These markings were not made in urgency or fear. They were made with patience and repetition, suggesting routine use over an extended period of time. This was a system, Hayes said quietly, breaking the silence without expecting response. The German Shepherd did not move. Instead, it remained still, as though acknowledging the statement without needing to confirm it. Hayes continued forward, moving toward the center where the ground was most disturbed, yet most structured. Here, faint outlines in the soil suggested the placement of temporary structures that had long since been removed. Not destroyed, but carefully taken down. The distinction mattered. It meant planning, not collapse. It meant intention, not loss. He knelt briefly near what appeared to be an anchor point in the ground, partially hidden beneath layers of pine needles and moss. The positioning suggested it had once supported something essential to the structure of this site. Around it, faint impressions indicated repeated activity concentrated in specific zones, likely work areas, rest areas, and navigation points. Everything about the layout suggested discipline rather than improvisation. As Hayes rose again, he glanced toward the German Shepherd. The animal had finally shifted its posture slightly, turning its head toward a specific direction beyond the clearing's far edge. Following its gaze, Hayes noticed a narrow continuation of the path, even less visible than before, disappearing into thicker forest where the canopy closed almost completely overhead. There were no obvious markers this time, only subtle disturbances in vegetation that indicated passage. Hayes exhaled slowly, realizing how far this investigation had already moved beyond standard explanation. This was no longer about identifying why a dog remained at an empty campsite. It was about uncovering an entire hidden structure of human presence, discipline, and disappearance embedded within the forest itself. And the dog was not guarding ruins. It was guarding continuity. Whatever had once been here was still connected, still intentional, and still waiting to be understood just beyond the next stretch of trees. The narrow forest corridor beyond the hidden clearing grew darker as Ranger Daniel Hayes and the German Shepherd continued deeper into terrain that no official map seemed to fully account for. The canopy above thickened so tightly that even the afternoon light struggled to reach the forest floor, leaving only scattered beams that shifted with every movement of the wind. Hayes adjusted his pace carefully, staying close behind the dog while observing how confidently it navigated the uneven ground. There was no hesitation in its movement, no sign of uncertainty, only a steady progression forward, as if every step had already been taken before. The path itself was no longer clearly defined. Instead, it revealed itself in fragments, compressed soil between roots, broken twigs aligned in subtle direction, and faint disturbances in moss that suggested repeated passage over time. Hayes began to notice a pattern forming within the disorder. The forest here was not random. It was structured in a way that implied long-term human familiarity, as if someone had once lived within it so consistently that the environment had adapted around their presence. After several minutes of silent movement, the German Shepherd stopped abruptly at the base of a large cedar tree. Its body remained still, but its attention sharpened. Hayes approached slowly, scanning the area before noticing something unusual near the trunk. Partially embedded in the bark was a small metal tag, weathered and dulled by age, but still bearing faint engraved markings. He knelt to examine it more closely. The design resembled identification equipment used in field operations, though its exact origin was difficult to determine due to corrosion. Around the base of the tree, he also found faint impressions in the soil, circular in pattern, suggesting that objects had once been placed here repeatedly over time. A checkpoint, Hayes muttered under his breath, though he immediately recognized that the term did not fully capture what he was seeing. This was not a temporary marker. It was part of a system. The German Shepherd shifted slightly, then began moving again, leading Hayes around the cedar tree and deeper into a narrowing passage between dense undergrowth. The forest grew quieter with each step, until even the sound of their movement felt distant and muted, as if absorbed by the environment itself. Hayes noticed additional markers along the way, though they were more subtle now. Small scratches on stone surfaces, arranged in deliberate sequences, and occasional breaks in vegetation that created a faint but consistent directional flow. Whoever had created this route had done so with precision and repetition, reinforcing the idea that it had been used not once, but many times over an extended period. As they advanced further, the terrain began to slope gently downward into a natural depression within the forest. The air grew cooler here, and the density of trees increased again, forming a partial enclosure that limited visibility beyond a short distance. The German shepherd finally stopped at the edge of this new space, standing still and facing forward. Hayes stepped beside it and looked into the area ahead. What he saw was not another campsite, nor a simple clearing, but the faint outline of something more structured buried beneath years of natural reclamation. Wooden fragments, partially hidden beneath moss and fallen branches, suggested the remains of a constructed site that had been intentionally concealed rather than abandoned carelessly. Hayes felt a quiet shift in understanding as he observed the scene. Each layer they uncovered did not end the story but extended it further inward, revealing that the dog was not guarding a place left behind. It was guiding him towards something that had never truly been closed. The deeper section of the forest opened gradually into a space that felt less like untouched wilderness and more like a place shaped by repeated human intent over time. Ranger Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of the depression, carefully observing the partially concealed structure beneath layers of moss, fallen branches, and years of natural decay. The German shepherd remained still. Beside him, its posture unchanged, its focus locked forward as if recognizing something far beyond what human perception could immediately interpret. Hayes stepped forward slowly, scanning every detail before committing fully to the space. The ground here was uneven but deliberately cleared in certain areas, suggesting that structures had once existed in a planned arrangement rather than random placement. He crouched near a partially exposed wooden frame buried under vegetation. The wood was aged but still showed signs of reinforcement, with joints that had been secured with precision rather than improvised construction. This was not a simple shelter. It had been part of a system designed for endurance and repetition. As Hayes brushed away layers of moss and debris, he uncovered additional structural elements aligned in a way that suggested multiple connected points rather than a single isolated building. The configuration implied purpose: work zones, storage sections, and transitional pathways all integrated into a compact operational layout. This was occupied for a long time, Hayes said quietly, though his voice felt absorbed by the surrounding forest rather than carried through it. The German shepherd finally moved, stepping carefully into the depression and circling once around the exposed remains before stopping at what appeared to be the central point of the structure. Its behavior changed subtly here, becoming more focused, more grounded, as if acknowledging a place of significance rather than simply following a trail. Hayes followed the dog's movement and noticed additional details emerging from beneath the soil. Small metallic fragments, corroded fasteners, and remnants of equipment lay scattered in controlled patterns that suggested systematic removal rather than chaotic abandonment. This was not a site that had collapsed. It had been dismantled with intention. Moving deeper into the area, Hayes discovered a section where the ground had been intentionally leveled more precisely than the surrounding terrain. The soil composition here was different, compacted in a way that indicated repeated activity over an extended period. Along the edges of this space were faint impressions of fixed anchor points, now empty, but clearly once used to secure structures or equipment. He paused, taking a slow look across the entire depression. The realization forming in his mind was no longer speculative. This had not been a campsite. It had been a sustained operational base, hidden deliberately within the forest and gradually erased from obvious recognition without removing every trace of its existence. The German shepherd suddenly lifted its head, turning toward a narrow continuation of the depression that led further downhill into denser vegetation. Hayes followed the line of sight and noticed a barely visible passage cutting through the undergrowth, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding environment unless viewed from a precise angle. There were no obvious markers here anymore, only subtle distortions in plant growth that suggested repeated passage. Hayes stood still for a moment, absorbing the full weight of what the forest was revealing layer by layer. Each location they had discovered did not end the story but expanded it further, connecting fragments of a larger hidden history. The dog was no longer simply guarding a campsite. It was leading him through the remnants of something that had been carefully removed from the world but never fully erased. The narrow passage beyond the depression grew tighter as Ranger Daniel Hayes and the German Shepherd continued deeper into the forest's hidden layers. The vegetation here was denser, older, and less disturbed by natural wind patterns, as if the space itself had been deliberately left undisturbed for a long period of time. Hayes moved carefully, placing each step with intention, his attention shifting between the ground and the subtle changes in the surrounding environment. The German Shepherd remained ahead, but its pace had slowed slightly, no longer leading with urgency, but with measured certainty, as if approaching a location it already understood on a deeper level. As they advanced, the forest began to reveal more signs of structured human presence, though heavily obscured by time and nature. Faint impressions in the soil indicated repeated travel along the same narrow corridor. Certain trees along the path bore barely visible markings, not fresh carvings, but old identifiers worn down by weather and moss growth. Hayes paused several times to examine these details, recognizing that they formed a directional pattern rather than isolated traces. This was a network, he said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. The German Shepherd stopped briefly at a fork in the hidden trail, then chose the left path without hesitation. Hayes followed, trusting the animal's consistency more than the limited visibility around him. The air grew cooler as they descended slightly into a lower section of the forest, where sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above. The environment felt increasingly enclosed, yet not unsafe, as though the forest had once been shaped around human activity that had since faded but not disappeared. After several minutes of careful movement, the trail opened into a wider concealed basin. Unlike the previous clearings, this space was almost entirely reclaimed by nature, yet traces of deliberate structure still remained beneath the surface. Hayes immediately noticed the unusual arrangement of tree growth patterns, which formed unnatural spacing intervals that suggested past clearing or construction. Near the center of the basin, partially hidden beneath layers of fallen branches and vegetation, he identified the remnants of what appeared to be a reinforced underground entry point. The structure was subtle, nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain unless observed closely. Wooden supports, now decayed but still aligned in geometric order, indicated the existence of a concealed access structure beneath the forest floor. Hayes crouched near the edge of the formation, carefully brushing away debris. The deeper he looked, the clearer the design became. This was not a shelter or campsite. It was an access node, part of a larger system hidden beneath the forest's natural cover. The German Shepherd stood directly beside the structure, no longer moving, its gaze fixed downward as if recognizing something familiar beneath the surface. Hayes looked at the dog, then back at the concealed structure, and slowly began to understand that every site they had discovered so far was not isolated. The abandoned campsite, the structured clearing, the marked trails, and now this concealed entry point were all connected. This was not a sequence of random locations. It was a deliberate network, built and maintained over time, then carefully hidden from plain sight. As Hayes stood, the weight of realization settled fully. The dog had not been guarding an empty campsite, nor wandering without purpose. It had been maintaining a connection to something still physically present beneath the forest, something waiting in silence. The German Shepherd finally shifted its gaze forward again, toward the darkness beyond the basin, where the forest narrowed once more into an unseen continuation. Hayes took a slow breath, tightened his grip on his field gear, and followed once again, understanding that whatever lay ahead was not an end point, but the continuation of a system that had never fully stopped operating. The concealed basin deeper in the forest felt different the moment Ranger Daniel Hayes stepped fully inside. The air was colder here, denser, and almost motionless, as if the forest itself had closed around this space to preserve whatever had once existed beneath it. The German Shepherd stood at the edge of the basin without moving forward immediately, its posture steady but more focused than before, as if it recognized a threshold rather than a destination. Hayes slowly scanned the surroundings, noting how unnatural the spacing of trees became in this area. Unlike the chaotic growth patterns of untouched wilderness, These trees followed subtle alignment variations, suggesting that the land had once been cleared and structured with deliberate purpose before being reclaimed by nature. He moved carefully toward the center, where the remains of what appeared to be a concealed access structure lay partially exposed beneath layers of soil, roots, and decayed wood. Unlike previous sites, this one showed deeper reinforcement. Metal supports, heavily corroded but still intact in shape, formed a partial outline of what might have once been an entry point below ground. Hayes crouched near the structure and brushed away debris with slow, precise movements. The deeper he looked, the clearer the design became. This was not temporary sheltering. It was engineered concealment. "This goes below the surface," he said quietly, more to confirm his own assessment than to communicate with anyone else. The German shepherd finally stepped closer, circling once around the exposed section before stopping at a fixed point near what seemed to be the original access boundary. Its behavior changed again here, becoming still in a way that suggested recognition rather than observation. Hayes followed the dog's position and noticed additional indicators embedded into nearby rocks. Small engraved markings, arranged in repeating sequences, extended outward from the structure like a directional framework. These were not random survival scratches. They followed a coded pattern that implied systematic navigation within a larger concealed environment. He exhaled slowly, realizing that everything they had uncovered so far was connected not just spatially, but structurally. The campsite, the clearing, the hidden trail network, and now this subterranean access point were all components of a single integrated system. Someone had built this deliberately, maintained it over time, and then carefully hidden its existence beneath layers of natural regrowth. As Hayes stood again, the German shepherd turned its head toward the darker edge of the basin, where the forest thickened into near impenetrable shadow. There were no visible markers leading forward now, only instinctive continuation suggested by the dog's unwavering attention. Hayes adjusted his gear and looked once more at the partially buried structure beneath him. Whatever lay below was not simply a forgotten remnant of the past. It was part of something still structurally intact in meaning, even if physically concealed. The realization settled heavily in his mind. The dog had not been guarding emptiness, nor preserving memory alone. It had been maintaining proximity to something that still existed, hidden but not gone. Without further hesitation, Hayes followed the German shepherd into the narrowing passage beyond the basin, where the forest swallowed the last traces of light and the next layer of truth waited silently beneath the ground. The narrowing passage beyond the concealed basin led Ranger Daniel Hayes and the German shepherd into a section of forest where natural structure gave way to something far more intentional. The canopy above thickened until almost no ambient light filtered through, forcing Hayes to rely on shape, sound, and the subtle movement of his surroundings to maintain orientation. The air felt heavier here, not physically but perceptually, as though the environment was compressing into a confined corridor shaped by long-term use rather than natural growth. The German shepherd moved ahead with unchanged precision, its pace steady but increasingly purposeful, as if recognizing progression through layers of a familiar system rather than entering unknown terrain. Hayes followed closely, scanning the ground for confirmation of what he already suspected. The soil beneath their feet was no longer random forest floor. It had been reinforced in places, compacted in linear segments that suggested repeated traffic along a defined underground route. Occasional metallic fragments appeared half-buried along the edges of the path, their corrosion patterns consistent with long-term exposure rather than recent abandonment. Hayes paused briefly to examine one such fragment embedded in a root cluster. It resembled part of a structural fastener, too engineered to belong naturally in this environment. This was maintained underground, he said quietly, the realization forming more fully as he spoke. The German shepherd stopped ahead at what appeared to be a natural dead end where dense roots and stone formations converged. Yet upon closer inspection, Hayes noticed irregularities in the alignment of the rock face. The arrangement was too symmetrical to be random geological formation. He stepped forward, running his hand along the surface until he found a subtle seam hidden beneath moss and dirt. With careful pressure, he revealed a narrow gap between stone panels that had been designed to blend seamlessly into the surrounding terrain. It was not a cave entrance. It was a concealed access point. The dog remained still, watching as Hayes traced the outline of the structure. The craftsmanship suggested intentional concealment on a scale far beyond surface-level hiding. Every edge had been shaped to mimic natural erosion, every joint disguised beneath organic growth patterns. Hayes stepped back slightly, assessing the full structure. This was not a simple shelter or survival cache. This was engineered concealment designed to remain undetected for extended periods of time. The German Shepherd finally moved again, placing itself directly in front of the hidden seam, as if confirming recognition. Its posture remained calm, but there was an unmistakable sense of finality in its stillness, as though they had reached a threshold that had been anticipated all along. Hayes felt a shift in understanding settle in slowly. Every site they had discovered above ground had been part of a larger design, but this point represented convergence. Whatever existed beyond this concealed entry was not separate from the network they had traced through the forest. It was the origin or continuation of it. He adjusted his stance, preparing for deeper exploration, while the forest around them remained completely silent, as if acknowledging that something long hidden was about to be revealed. The German Shepherd stepped slightly aside, leaving the access point unobstructed. Hayes placed his hand on the seam once more, realizing that what lay beyond was not simply another discovery. It was the core of everything they had been following since the abandoned campsite, and the answer to why the dog had never once left its post above ground. The concealed seam in the forest wall finally yielded under Ranger Daniel Hayes' careful pressure. With a slow, grinding release, the disguised stone panel shifted inward just enough to reveal a narrow gap, exhaling a rush of colder air from within. The temperature difference was immediate and unnatural, as though the space beyond had been sealed off from the forest's natural cycle for a long time. The German Shepherd did not move forward first. It remained beside the entrance, steady and alert, watching. Hayes as if confirming that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Hayes adjusted his position and carefully widened the opening just enough to illuminate what lay beyond. The beam from his handheld light cut through darkness that felt dense rather than empty, revealing a descending passage carved into the earth. The walls were reinforced with aged structural materials, partially covered by mineral buildup and time-worn residue, but still unmistakably engineered. This was not a natural formation. It was a constructed descent into something deliberately hidden beneath the forest. Hayes stepped forward cautiously, placing one foot inside the threshold while keeping his body partially outside. The silence inside the passage was absolute, absorbing even the smallest ambient sound from the forest behind him. The German Shepherd finally entered after him, its movement controlled and deliberate, staying close but not rushing ahead. As they descended, the air grew cooler and more stable, suggesting controlled depth rather than natural cave environment. Hayes noticed markings along the inner walls, similar in style to those they had seen above ground, but more frequent and more precise. These were not navigation aids for wilderness survival. They were part of an internal system designed to maintain orientation within a structured underground network. The passage widened gradually, transitioning from a narrow entry corridor into a reinforced tunnel that extended deeper than expected. At intervals, faint traces of old equipment mounts and structural anchors remained embedded in the walls, indicating long-term usage rather than temporary concealment. Hayes paused briefly to examine one of these anchors, noting the precision of its placement. This was operational, he said quietly, the realization no longer speculative but grounded in accumulated evidence. The German Shepherd stopped several steps ahead, its body angled toward the deeper end of the tunnel where visibility faded completely into darkness. There was no hesitation in its stance, only recognition. Hayes followed its gaze and felt the weight of understanding settle more fully. Every layer they had uncovered. Above ground had been a fragment of something larger, but this descent confirmed that the true structure had always been below the surface. What they had followed through the forest was not random movement or isolated memory. It was access to a hidden system that had been carefully preserved and concealed from the world above. As Hayes took another step forward into the tunnel, the sound of the forest behind them disappeared entirely, replaced by a silence that felt engineered rather than natural. The German Shepherd remained just ahead, guiding without force, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to complete a path that had never truly been abandoned. The deeper they moved into the underground passage, the air became increasingly stable, no longer carrying the irregular humidity of the forest above, but instead maintaining a controlled, almost artificial consistency that confirmed long-term structural maintenance. Ranger Daniel Hayes kept one hand near the tunnel wall as he advanced, using the faint texture changes as reference points, while his flashlight revealed layers of reinforced construction embedded beneath stone and soil. The German Shepherd continued ahead at a steady pace, no longer acting as a guide in uncertainty, but as if following a path already memorized through repetition rather than discovery. After several minutes of descent, the tunnel began to widen into a larger constructed chamber. The transition was gradual but unmistakable, marked by stronger structural supports, more precise wall alignment, and the presence of embedded fixtures that suggested intentional design for sustained occupancy. Hayes slowed as he entered the chamber fully, sweeping his light across the space. What emerged from the darkness was not a ruin, but a preserved operational environment. There were rows of organized storage sections along the walls, some sealed containers still intact, others left partially open as if access had been interrupted rather than abandoned. Faint markings on the floor indicated designated zones, suggesting the space had once functioned with strict internal order. The German Shepherd stopped at the center of the chamber and remained still. Its posture shifted slightly, not in alertness, but in recognition, as if it had finally reached the origin point of every path it had followed above ground. Hayes stepped further inside, carefully observing every detail. On one wall, he noticed a structured board with faded maps and layered markings beneath protective casing that had deteriorated over time. Nearby, a communication station stood partially preserved, its equipment aged but still aligned in a deliberate configuration. Nothing appeared chaotic or hastily left behind. Instead, everything suggested a controlled cessation of activity rather than sudden disappearance. Hayes lowered his flashlight slightly as he processed the scale of what he was seeing. This was not a survival shelter. It was not a temporary field site. It was a coordinated underground operational hub, hidden beneath years of forest growth and intentionally removed from surface recognition. The German Shepherd finally moved again, walking toward a raised platform at the far end of the chamber. Hayes followed slowly, his attention drawn to the structure as it became clearer in the beam of his light. On the platform stood a single reinforced storage unit, sealed but intact, positioned as if it had been deliberately preserved rather than discarded. The dog stopped beside it and looked back at Hayes for the first time with direct acknowledgement, no longer guiding but confirming arrival. Hayes approached the unit carefully and placed his hand on its surface. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage, and no indication that it had been disturbed since sealing. The realization settled in with quiet finality. Everything they had uncovered, every campsite, every hidden marker, every structured trail through the forest, had been leading to this preserved point beneath the ground. The German Shepherd had not been guarding emptiness or memory alone. It had been maintaining continuity, ensuring that this place remained connected to the world above until it could be found again. Hayes stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of understanding replacing uncertainty. Whatever had once operated here had not vanished. It had simply been, waiting beneath the surface, preserved through time, through structure, and through the unwavering presence of a dog that had never once left its post above ground.